Okay, well, thank you, Dino, for inviting me, and thank you all, both online and in the room. And I hope you find this topic kind of interesting and challenging. It's certainly one that's occupied my mind for pretty much from the start of my career. And the reason why I chose this topic actually was after rereading Dino's description of what this seminar series is about, right? Because the spirit of the series seems to be to kind of recover what has been regarded as irrational in the history of disciplines. And he specifically indicates, religion and theology as among the things that we're talking about in this series. And so I'm going to start by making what I think is a very obvious point that relates to this. And that is the idea that if you want to think about historical revisionism in science, right? And so we can understand historical revisionism in science to mean, very basically, the idea of scientists or historians of science rewriting the past of science, right, in order to put the current science in a very positive light. Right? Or at least the science one is trying to defend in a very positive light. Because, of course, you can have forms of historical revisionism that, in a sense, are intended to champion a kind of alternative point of view. But generally speaking, when we talk about historical revisionism in science, we're talking about kind of the normal history of science that, in fact, scientists tell science students when they enter into the field, the kind of history of science that's sort of presupposed in a lot of popular science writing, for example. And so if you're looking at it this way, then when we think about revisionism, one of the things that we're obviously thinking about is what kind of stuff, in a sense, is being revised. And revised here is almost like a euphemism, because revised usually means eliminated, right, or abandoned. And that's a very important part of historical revisionism. It's a streamlining of the history. Right? It's a streamlining of the history for a very particular purpose, namely to legitimize and promote, you might say, the dominant paradigm in science. And I will say a little bit more about Thomas Kuhn, who is the man behind the notion of paradigm, because he had a very keen sense of what I'm talking about here. Okay? So, in fact, my interest in historical revisionism in science largely is due to my reading of his work. And if you know anything about my own work, I am very critical of Thomas Kuhn, but I think on this point, in terms of trying to make sense of how science legitimizes itself, not only to itself, but also to the larger society, this kind of historical revisionism is central. In fact, it might even be the most important thing. And so what's involved in this, I think, is very important. But the first thing to say about it is the stuff that if you want to think about what is number one to be eliminated from the history of science, if you're presenting this kind of revisionist standpoint to promote science, is religion, right? And why do I say that? Well, because if you look at just about all the major contributors to science prior to maybe the middle of the 20th century, right, they all had some kind of religious or theological interest and motivation, and certainly impacted in the way in which they did their science and the kinds of theories to which they were attracted in science and that they wanted to test and develop and so forth, okay? Now, to be sure, I think it is also fair to say that most of these people had rather heterodox religious views. So we're not talking about people whose religious views were, mainstream. And in fact, during their lifetimes, they often suppressed their views, right? They wouldn't let their views sort of come out publicly, at least not in the scientific writings, okay? And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But the point is that these people were very much animated by kind of religious and theological considerations. And very often, and of course, because revisionist history tends to be written very much after the fact, right? When you look at the older figures, right? And so the farther back you go, the more obviously religious and theological their motivation is, right? It's easier in a way to eliminate that stuff, right? Because they're not around, right? In a sense, when you present Newton, you don't have to worry about what Newton thinks about your presentation, right? You can present this very kind of airbrushed version of Newton that's just about Principia Mathematica and all the interest that he had in God and astrology and alchemy and all these things which were also related to issues of divination. That you could just marginalize because you don't have Newton to worry about anymore. Also, Newton was a self-suppressor. I mean, that's another important point, right? He himself did not make a lot of this stuff public, but when he died and his library was made available, once people started to look at what he had in his library, right, and the kinds of experiments that he was privately doing, himself, it becomes very clear, right, that there was a very big kind of theological backdrop to his thinking, and he is not alone, right? He's not alone. And of course, historians, the people who we normally call historians of science, who are not historians for science, but as it were, are historians of science who are trying to come up with what they regard as a kind of, more or less accurate representation of what was going on in history. Those guys, right, very quickly hit upon this. And of course, and then sometimes you can see, when you have scientists arguing amongst themselves about fundamental issues in their lifetime, right, as they go further into things, very often these kinds of larger theological religious concerns rise to the surface. Now, as you get into the 19th and 20th century, these disagreements tend to be expressed in, I think, what philosophers would recognize more as metaphysical, right? So in other words, there aren't like labels attached to particular denominations of Christianity or something like that, but rather they're sort of metaphysical views, right? But the metaphysical views, if you sort of trace it back in the biography of the scientist concerned, you see it has to do very often with heterodox Christian or post-Christian, you might say, right, views that these people had, right? So if you look at, so for example, things like monism as a cosmological view, panpsychism is an example of it, right? These kinds of views that become very kind of prominent metaphysically and very often feature in debates that scientists have when they argue about fundamental issues. These are basically downstream effects of largely religious and theological considerations. It's just that they've been kind of laundered, you might say, over the centuries. But of course, even those things, right, which we might recognize as philosophy in some way, right, those things get sort of laundered out of the histories of the revisionist histories of science, right? So you try to demetaphysicalize as well as detheologize. And what you just present is basically scientists arguing about which among a set of hypotheses have the best empirical support for them, right? I mean, this is kind of what revisionist history of science wants to get across to the science student and to the general public, that science is primarily driven by this sort of idea that you do have theories in science, there's no doubt about it, but in a sense, the currency in which the theories are to be cashed out is going to be empirical phenomena, and then the methodology of science in terms of how you actually generate the phenomena, whether they be through observation or experimentation or something else, right, then that becomes the way in which you determine who's right and who's wrong. So in other words, the debates in science are meant to go downward from the top, right? They go from the theory to the data, and the data is in some sense supposed to decide the matter, right? So in a sense, the whole focus of your attention as someone who is a student of science, right, or someone who is trying to understand what gives science, its great epistemic power, right, is to focus downward, right, is not to think it is because there's been some kind of grand metaphysical perspective that sort of guides the whole process and provides a kind of basis, for legitimizing the thing. You want to move away from that view and down to a view where we're talking about issues that can be resolved at the empirical level. And why is that from a legitimizing standpoint to science students? And here Kuhn is very good, right? It's because that's what most of these science students are going to do if they become professional scientists, right? They're not being trained to be cosmologists or metaphysicians or theologians or anything like that, right? They are being trained to be what Kuhn calls normal science puzzle solvers, right? So they're basically going to be working at the coalface of the data. And that, because the science students are being trained to do that, you want, in a sense, to kind of orient your history in that direction and kind of remove all the stuff that might seem, kind of interesting, but a bit of a distraction from that, especially given that the day-to-day work of science, of collecting the observations and assessing how they relate to various hypotheses, is a bit dull in itself. So you have to actually come up, in a sense, you do need to come up with this kind of master narrative, which revisionist history comes up with, right, in order to really motivate these science students to continue doing science, because if you talk too much about philosophy and metaphysics and theology and all that, then the science students will want to do that. Right? And so there is a very practical issue here, right? There's a very practical issue, and that also has a kind of a spillover effect in terms of the popular science. At least popular science, in a sense, in the world we live in now, popular science has actually become much more interesting and much more politicized. But if we talk about the way popular science was kind of originally conceived as kind of the public relations arm of the scientific community, right? That kind of view of popular science, right? The idea is to actually have the public on board with that view of science, right? So in other words, in popular science, right, while you might say that, Newton and Galileo or Darwin or whatever are geniuses, that's a very, big word in popular science, right, calling people geniuses. Nevertheless, the nature of their genius has to do with their abilities of observation and reasoning relating to the phenomena of the science. So in other words, we are not presenting, if in popular science writing, you do not see geniuses like Galileo, Newton, and Darwin being presented as great philosophers, great politicians, right? Great metaphysicians, great gurus, right? I mean, you're not seeing them presented that way, right? The genius comes, as it were, from having an amplified version of the qualities of mind that the professional scientist has, maybe in a more mediocre way, right? That is kind of the way in which the genius of the science is presented. So it's not the romantic genius, right? Because if you think about the way the term genius first comes into play in public discourse in the early 19th century, and it's associated with Romanticism, right? The genius in that context was someone who, in a way, had this incredibly, cosmic kind of view that they realized often in many different disciplines. You think of somebody, for example, like Goethe, right, who was operating in the arts and the sciences and all this kind of stuff. And in a way, he was a kind of pan-human, right? And there was that romantic conception of the genius that was prominent in the early 19th century, and we're familiar with it. We associate it largely with the arts these days. But the point about the scientific genius, when we talk about popular science writing, is a much more limited concept, and it's one that's used to subservient to the professional view of the scientist that the revisionist history is promoting. Okay? And so I think, that is the kind of, that's the thing. That's revisionist history of science. Revisionist history of science is about that sort of phenomena, which I think is very recognizable. And Kuhn makes, I think, a very good point that, in a sense, given the nature of scientific work, you kind of need this history to give a kind of context, right? Because the scientific work itself is highly specialized, perhaps boring on a day-to-day basis, right? And very much focused on the generation and testing of phenomena, right? So in a sense, you need that kind of historical story to serve that kind of view of the scientist. So the point that Kuhn, so when you call something revisionist history, as I've been doing, and certainly this is my intention, it sounds critical or negative, right? Revisionist history, you're somehow not representing it properly, right? You're doing something else. And I do believe that's true. But when Kuhn talks about this revisionist history, he means it positively. He actually thinks this is part of the professional training of scientists, right, is to internalize this kind of sense of where they came from, and which then motivates them to where they're going. Okay, so that I think is a very important point. And I got to say that Kuhn, when he writes about this in the structure of scientific revolutions, he is unabashed in the way he talks about this. So he characterizes this kind of history as Orwellian. He uses that adjective, okay? And so George Orwell, right, 1984, The Ministry of Truth, right? Winston Smith, the protagonist of that novel, what does he do for a living? He's basically rewriting the newspapers, right, of the past, right, according to what the current foreign policy is of the country he's living in. And his country is a bit like Trump land in a way, declares wars and stops wars, and it's kind of a crazy place, the place he lives. And so what happens is, certain countries were once foes and they become friends and vice versa, right? And you need to rewrite all the newspapers from the past to show that, in fact, we've had a very consistent stance throughout, right? And this is a full-time job, and there are loads of people doing this. Right, they're all scribbling down and you're rewriting the newspapers. If you've ever seen the movie Brazil, right, Terry Gilliam film, right, from the 1980s, right, in a sense that is kind of located in a kind of George Orwell space, okay, that is about this rewriting of history stuff. And so Kuhn, this is what Kuhn says, the revisionist. So how do you know this is happening? Well, because you can look at successive edition of textbooks in various academic in scientific disciplines, right? And as new breakthroughs get made, right, the subsequent edition of the textbook, very often what you see is a somewhat, not necessarily major, but tweaking of what the history is that ends up leading up to the discovery. Right? The new discovery that happens to be flavor of the month in physics, right? And so what does that mean in practice? Well, it means, for example, that certain kinds of discoveries and theories and so forth that were previously not seen as very important become important, and vice versa, right? So the relative standing of the significance of various, theories and phenomena shifts. It's not like, in a way, you're just inventing new stuff, and it's because that's the whole thing, right? That in a sense you're always working kind of with the same history in a way, right? But the relative significance of the different aspects of the history changes, right? And of course, if you're just going from edition to edition of a textbook, right, the changes are relatively minor. But if you look at textbooks that, let's say, have gone through 15 editions, as some of these textbooks have, right, you look at number 1 and you look at number 15, right, you do see difference of how the history is being presented to the students. Okay? Now, this is so this phenomena is ongoing, right? And it's important, and it seems to serve a very important function, right? And so let me add one other aspect of the function that is closely associated with Kuhn's view of paradigms, right? Because the thing about a paradigm for Kuhn in science, and remember, when I say science here, I've got to be clear about this. We're talking about, physics is like the gold standard for this argument, and of course you might want to include chemistry, right? And Kuhn did not think biology had a paradigm. And this gets to the sense of what a paradigm is, and he certainly didn't think social science had a paradigm. The point about a paradigm is that the paradigm has a kind of monopoly over what counts as legitimate research in the field, right? And from that standpoint, let's say physics, right? The history of physics is a winner-take-all proposition. In other words, if you are the dominant paradigm in physics, you own the whole history of physics, regardless of whether people who, whether the people who actually came up with these discoveries, if they were, teleported back through time travel and they were sat in a room with you, whether they would agree with your assumptions about the kind of phenomena, right? So in other words, people with radically different metaphysical, religious, theological, whatever assumptions have in fact contributed to the history of every science, right? And then what happens is that aspect, that difference in background just gets laundered out. And because these people are dead, there's no accountability, right? This is why historians of science, who are professional, and they're trying to basically resurrect all these people, right? They get very upset at the way scientists talk about history is precisely for that reason, right? But that is the realpolitik of what's going on here, right? That basically, it's a winner-take-all thing. If I'm in the dominant paradigm in physics, I own everything that happened in physics, regardless of the motivations of the people who came up with the stuff, even if they disagree radically with my metaphysical assumptions. right? In other words, they may have come at conclusions that we regard as still valid from opposite metaphysical or religious or theological assumptions from the ones we come up with. And especially, if we're talking about a world of scientists who are mostly atheists, right? Very radically different in many cases, right? Because the guys in the past were theists of some sort. Okay? So this is a really important part of the nature of paradigm, right? It's kind of winner take all thing. And that's why this business of, having this kind of historical revisionism, drummed into you is really important, right? And because in fields like physics, there is only one dominant paradigm and everybody else is fringe, right? There's a very strong distinction in that. That therefore you can get away with it, okay? And this is something about the sociology of science, right? This is about the institutionalization of these fields, and we can have a discussion about that, but I think it's really important, just at a very basic level, that the different sciences, and whether we're talking about physics or we're talking about the social sciences, right, are institutionalized quite differently. And so in that respect, they have relatively different control over their own history. Okay? So physicists, in a way, can control their history for their own purposes in a way in which, let's say, sociologists can't. Okay? And I think one of the ways you see this in practice is you think about it. Okay? If you're a historian of physics nowadays, not so much maybe 50 years ago when Kuhn was writing, but nowadays, if you're a historian of physics, you're probably in a history department or a history of science department. You're not in a physics department. Okay? If you're a historian of sociology, you probably are in a sociology department, and you're probably actually part of the active curriculum in sociology. And that's because fields like sociology, which do not have dominant paradigms in this kind of monolithic Kuhnian sense, right, end up being in a kind of, the hermeneutical, right? They're in a constant interaction with their past. Right? In a sense, the past never disappears. There's not a clear distinction between the present and the past in a sense, right? So, think about Marx. Think about the influence that Marx still exerts, right, over sociology and, of course, other social sciences as well. Right? That, that's not left behind. That's somehow still always around, right? Even though the world changes and so forth. And, in sociology, we can think about Max Weber or Durkheim or people like that. And it's interesting because the social sciences really vary a lot in this regard, right? So politics in a way is closer to sociology, but if you look at fields like economics and even psychology, psychology, which was a field that I did a minor in that when I was an undergraduate, and even though everybody had to learn the history of psychology, it was really interesting about the different kinds of history textbooks in psychology that were available. It all depended what school, because I was an undergraduate in the 1970s, and it was this very active debate between behaviorists and the people who we would now call cognitivists, right? They were just emerging at the time, and behaviorism was in decline. And depending on who was actually teaching the course and the textbook they use, you get a history of psychology that has largely the same people, but radically different emphases. Radically different. Not these incremental changes that I was talking about in the history of physics, but really radically different. So a behaviorist history of psychology is radically different from a cognitivist history of psychology. Starting from the standpoint of what is the discipline about? What is the subject matter of the discipline? Right? Behaviorists say it's about behavior. And all this talk about mind and consciousness has been a distraction. Whereas, of course, if you're a cognitivist, all those issues are front and center, right? And the discussion of behavior is meant as a way of trying to get at these deeper issues of mind, right? And so that leads to, having a history where they both recognize the same sorts of figures, but the way they are weighted in their significance is radically different. It's like alternative universes. Right? So that was an interesting phenomenon, right? And so this business about the ability of the discipline to control its own history for purposes of legitimizing itself, right, varies across disciplines. And Kuhn is really talking about physics as a kind of gold standard. But let me tell you, if you look at the history of the social sciences and certainly the biological sciences, there's always been a lot of physics envy on this point, right? So in other words, a lot of meta-level effort, you might say, right? Kind of level about, not the level about what theories we ought to have in our discipline, but rather the theories about how our discipline ought to be organized, right? Have been largely inspired by physics. So even within sociology, which in a way is, you might say maybe the most pluralistic of the social sciences, there has been debates about whether the fact that there are all these different ways of understanding the history and dealing with the history, whether that's problematic and holding the field back from making progress, right? Because the progress issue, right, is very closely tied to there being a single direction of travel. And that's where the whole monolithic nature of the paradigm matters. Because if you don't present a kind of consistent story, right, that covers all the practitioners, right, then the field can go in any direction. And then you no longer have science, right? And so this is part of, so Kuhn was very good at nailing this kind of thing down. And he was certainly, if you look at how other disciplines respond to this phenomena that physics in a way really exemplifies, the other disciplines are responsive to this, right? And since they register it. Now, whether it's good or not, right, that's another story, right? He thought it was, right? Clearly he thought it was, and a lot of these people who want their fields to imitate physics think it is, right? Because they think this is the only way that you can, in fact, distinguish a sort of progressive knowledge, progressive form of inquiry from just people trying to find out stuff, right? So in other words, how does science different from other knowledge practices? Well, you might say it's because it can control its own history. It's self-directed, right? And behind this, of course, are all the issues, and Kuhn himself mentions it, and I think it's always worth remembering, about the Charter of the Royal Society in 1660, right, which is very much about excluding stuff, right? The Charter of the Royal Society, is basically saying, if you want to talk about religion, go somewhere else. If you want to talk about politics, go somewhere else. If you want to engage in rhetorical flourishes, go somewhere else, right? But we're only going to look at the stuff that's either observable, measurable, or calculable, right? This is kind of what the Charter of the Royal Society says. And this was a way of kind of creating a space where the scientists, this new kind of social role of the scientist, right, could actually control their space, right? Because in a sense, what they have excluded are the things where people who are not scientists actually would have a say, right? And in a sense could have some, interfere in some sense or influence in some sense what the scientists are actually doing. So this kind of self-autonomization, right, is something that is very much part of the early stages of the institutionalization of science, which physics, in a way, really takes to the max, okay? And of course, the kind of micro-social process that is most important here is peer review, okay? And we're all familiar with that. And the whole point about peer review is that the only people who are eligible to evaluate a piece of scientific research, right, are people who are engaged in the field, right, or at least relatively close to the field. And who are these people? Well, these are people who are kind of trained in the same way and they recognize each other, right? So in other words, a peer would be someone who, if you haven't met or heard of before, you could check from their credentials. They were trained sufficiently like you that you could trust their judgment on the matter. So this is kind of what peer review is about. And what that does is it greatly restricts the space, right? And all these people who've been trained the same way, of course, have been largely trained in the kind of same historical horizon, right, of where the discipline has come from, and they generally make similar judgments about where the discipline should go. So of course, and this becomes very interesting, in the sciences, especially as we get toward toward the end of the social sciences, but sometimes even in biology and even in physics these days, right? Where part of the peer review rejection of articles, right, comes from the fact that, this person is not really on the wave, right? This person is doing something weird or different. It's not necessarily because what this person is doing is wrong in some demonstrable sense, but in a sense it is not relevant to the future of the discipline as we are currently pursuing it, right? They're doing something else, right? There are a lot of those kinds of judgments that are made in peer review, right? And you ask, where do the intuitions to make those judgments come from? Well, it comes from the historical horizon of how these people have been taught, right? They have a certain sense of what the trajectory is, right? Where things have come from and where they're going, and certain things they just don't see in the future of their field. Even if it's stuff that in the past the field pursued, right? But they don't see it in the future. And so very often peer review judgments are of this kind. I know this, I'm a journal editor and been very much involved in journals from the beginning of my career. And so this is a very common phenomenon. So this business about historical revisionism within the sciences is not just about the writing of history, in the sense I began with, but it reflects all kinds of other institutional features about the way in which science has emerged in the modern era and in a way maintains its legitimacy. By the way, how much more time do I have? Just to see how much more I can introduce here. 4 to 10. 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I know. No, I understand. I mean, it's just, I've only got through the first paragraph. So the point now is going to be to talk about stuff that's still relevant to this and not get into a whole bunch of other stuff, which I thought I might have time to tell you, but who knows? It might come up in the questions. Okay. So, this kind of view that I've been presenting here, I want to say 2 things about it, right? One thing is that in a way, even though it's been very powerful historically, at least for the last, you might say, 200 years, I would say, because basically Kuhn believes that Newtonian mechanics was really the first paradigm, and it had all these characteristics that I was talking about. And Newton, of course, writes Principia Mathematica 1687, so it's like the generation after the establishment of the Royal Society, and Newton is, of course, a member of it. And so that's the first kind of, instantiation of this kind of view that I've been giving you, which then kind of gets carried on to this day. One of the things I would say about it is that, it has worked very well in the modern period, because one of the things that I think it would be fair to say about the modern period is that the way in which science self-censored itself in the charter of the Royal Society by excluding the religion, by excluding the politics, and so forth, in a way really set set the pace, you might say, for the secularization of knowledge in general in the modern era, right? So in other words, it became increasingly common for religious issues, right, to kind of drop out or be seen as too hot to handle, and what when we talk about secularization, what we often mean is that we have the rise of privacy, right? So in other words, religious issues become matters of conscience, not matters of public debate, okay? So all of that is part of the secularization of the modern era. It's also seen as kind of one of the virtues of liberalism, as a kind of, encouraging a tolerant society where people who privately hold quite different beliefs about the spirit and so forth, right, don't have to be at each other's throats in the way they were in the wars of religion, right, that basically just ended in England just as the Royal Society was starting, right? I mean, so there's a sense in which, the Royal Society and science itself was kind of a beacon of what became a kind of larger secularization that overtook Western society. And certainly by the time we get to, let's say, 1870, where you actually have nation states taking over the education, right, from the churches, right, in a kind of big way, that's kind of the direction of travel. So in other words, the exclusion of religion, the exclusion of theology, right, which is kind of what I say is kind of the hallmark of historical revisionism in science, in a way went very well with the direction of travel of the history of modernity, right? And so in that sense, they got away with it, you might say. Now, where we are now in history is different, right? And for a few reasons. I mean, one thing that I've been alluding to in the talk has been, of course, the rise of the history of science as a field, right? And the idea of doing history of science for its own sake, right, in a sense. And so that very naturally starts to uncover all of this theological and religious stuff, right? And there are popularizations of that too, right? And so the general public is now getting a much more depending on how you look at it, nuanced or confused, right, view about what the history of science really, what is this history of science, right? Because if you have, if you have popular histories of science that, still have this idea that we're heading in a progressive direction, and then you have these other, histories of science that are basically saying it's a lot of, about political and metaphysical and religious disputes that just get somehow resolved in the laboratory for a little while, right? Those are two quite different stories, and they might lead you to wonder, okay, well then, to what extent can I rely on this kind of knowledge, especially given, the official prominence it has in our society, right? When we're talking about COVID or whatever, right? All these public policy issues where science is being mobilized, and it's not just a particular scientist, right? But the particular scientist, as it were, is seen as standing in the shoulders of giants in this great tradition of science and so forth, right? In a sense, we really do presuppose that kind of historical revisionist view insofar as we unquestionably continue to rely on science. But the point is, as these other kinds of histories are being written, this is shaking that kind of confidence. And of course, there are other things going on in the world, which we associate, perhaps I talk about it as post-truth, right? Where there's just a sort of a general suspicion of the kinds of accounts that people provide for their own activities, right? Especially when there are alternative accounts available on the internet, right? And I think that general phenomena, right, which goes beyond the discussion of historical revisionism, creates a lot of, creates not only doubt, I would say, but it also creates opportunities because, again, another part of the puzzle, is that we live in a time where more and more people not only have access to information, but they're also educated. Now you might not like what these educated people are saying and doing, but from a raw, standpoint, this is the most educated people in the world right now. Okay, more people going to university, more people, this is it, and they have more information than ever before. And so what a lot of people are doing, enough people are doing, is coming up with their alternative histories, right? Alternative ways of spinning what's going on. Okay, and these all kind of serve a sort of delegitimizing function in a way to the revisionist history, right? It makes it a much more open kind of situation. And so in a way, what it's doing is it's sort of challenging this kind of Kuhnian assumption, which is actually an assumption that has been borne out historically in the modern era, that science can only survive and go forward as a progressive institution if it controls its history. And if and that the fields that do not control their history, where there's always contestation going on, right, they do not have that kind of progressive sort of, single-minded, future-oriented look that science has, okay? And in fact, Kuhn makes this very explicit with regard to the different. He contrasts science with religion in this respect. He sees religion as very much a subject to endless contestation. Okay, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that religion is something that, in a way, the difference between the experts and the lay people who are believers in the religion is not as strict as the difference between the professional scientists and the general public. Okay, right, and as you know, right, in religions we have all these movements. In Christianity, Protestantism is a great example, right, of the people taking back their faith from the experts. Right, in this case, the priests. And this is a very regular kind of feature that you see in the history of religion, and it usually means realigning the history and coming up with a different story about what really went on and so forth. And Kuhn's point was that science was different because it stopped all that kind of struggle. It stopped all that kind of contestation, and that there was a forward direction, right? Everybody was on. And of course, you might, if you wanted to give the complete picture, you'd say, and of course, by going in that forward direction, science was able to aid various aspects of society, especially to people with power in society, in ways that kind of radically changed the societies, in a way the effects of which was to make those societies more science friendly, right? So in a sense, the science was very much involved in these second order effects. And so the thing is, we're living in a time where that kind of situation is breaking down, and science is getting to be more like, well, in a way, physics is becoming more like sociology, right? And all of them are becoming more like religion, right? In the sense of the contestation. Now, this is kind of interesting, and I'll close on this point, because one of the things that, in a way, Kuhn neglects, and I think scientists are often very blindsided by their critics, right? The kind of people I'm talking about, the post-truth type people, the people who doubt the authority of what the scientists say. I think they're often blindsided by these people because there's a sense in which when you go back to this sort of elimination of theology that sort of begins this whole process of historical revisionism, the theology was really very crucial in the very idea that you could have a kind of unified view of the world, which science and especially physics subscribes to, right? Because if you go back to Newton, you go back to these guys in the scientific revolution, even though they had very heterodox religious views, what they believed they were doing when they were trying to come up with laws and stuff like this, right, is first of all, they believed that there was a universe. In other words, it was this one reality which they could understand, hence the need to do science. It was intelligible. And why was it intelligible? Because we as humans were created in the image and likeness of the Creator. So the intelligibility of the universe, right, the unification of the universe, all of these issues, right, which in a way are kind of the background metaphysical framework for doing modern science, right, come from a certain kind of conception of the relationship between humans and God, okay? And it's trying to make sense of that, right? And the prospect that humans could do that, right? So it wasn't just accepting the metaphysics, but seeing the metaphysics as a challenge, as it were, to get into the mind of God, right? Which all these physicists still talk about, even when they're atheists. That this, in fact, this metaphysical assumption was really important in motivating all these people, right, all these scientists to actually think that coming up with a sort of monolithic way of looking at things, even if it changes over time, right? Like these paradigms that go through these scientific revolutions. The very idea to think that there was one thing that we're all trying to get at, right? That is where the theological assumption begins, right? It begins in motivating that. Because I think the problem that we have nowadays is that we've become so comfortable with the idea that maybe there are multiple worlds, maybe there are multiple realities, maybe we can have multiple forms of knowledge. Why do we need this kind of unified thing, right? The unified thing, it just seems to be oppressive and hegemonic and all that jazz, right? And so the scientists, because they've lost touch with the theological origin of their project, they're incapable of answering this objection, which I think is a very real objection. If you don't believe, where do you get this belief that there's a unified reality that has, as it were, a privileged method to get to it? Where does that come from, right? And I think that's something that scientists will have to answer. And if they don't go back and understand the theological roots of their own inquiry, they're not going to have many resources to mobilize. And I'll stop there.